Peter Baker is chief White House correspondent for The New York Times and MS Now contributor and co-author of The Divider about Trump's first term. Ashley Parker is staff writer for The Atlantic and an MS Now political analyst. MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin is with me in studio. I want to start, Lisa, with what is happening today. I mean, Trump has tried before with this hush money case to get it moved to federal court, right? But is there any reason to believe this time could be different?
I think it will be different in terms of the substance of the opinion, which is to say, Judge Alvin Hellerstein, who is the judge who has considered this twice before, is under instructions from the federal appeals court that oversees his court, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, to basically consider more factors in explaining why there was not good cause for him to reconsider whether or not Trump's removal of this case to federal court was justified. He has twice denied it before. He is now being told, basically, show your work, explain to us what factors you considered. And among those factors, he's being asked to explain, is Trump even a federal officer entitled to remove this case to federal court? There's a question about when you are a former federal officer, as Donald Trump was at the time, do you qualify as somebody who can take advantage of this statute? The other question in terms of what Hellerstein has to figure out is, can you move after a trial has already happened, after a conviction has already been entered, to move a case from state court to federal court, as Trump lawyers tried to do? Based on some external reporting about the argument this morning, it sounds like he's very dubious that that's even allowed. And so I think we'll see a much more detailed opinion. But, Chris, ultimately, I think the result will still be the same.
Okay, Peter, I said at the beginning of this that these stories are embarrassing. But as someone who has written about Trump, followed him closely, does he get embarrassed?
Yeah, it's a good question. And that conversation is happening in Washington all the time. What would be enough to actually embarrass President Trump when it comes to his conduct with women? Because if you go back to the beginning of his time on the national stage, he's been accused time and again of various sexual misconduct. He's been found liable in civil court for sexual abuse. In E. Jean Carroll's case, he had that Access Hollywood tape come out right before the 2016 election, in which he's heard talking about how you can physically grab women and they allow you to do it if you're a star. He has been accused by literally, I think more than 20 women of various things that you wouldn't want your son to be accused of, or your father, not much less your president. And yet he seems not to let it stop him. But you're right. The Epstein thing seems to be something different. It's just curious why. Why has he been so resistant on releasing these files? It took an act of Congress by both parties to overrule his resistance to releasing all these files. And yet, as he said, they haven't released anything in the last few days that seemed to tell us something we didn't know, which is that he was friends with Jeffrey Epstein, that they did share, a desire for women. But at the same time, that's not a crime. Is there something there that's still being hidden? People don't know because of the redactions and the uncertainty about whether they can trust this Justice Department.
So, Ashley, then you have, of course, the daily headlines. Even today, 6 days in since these were all released, all related to Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, Trump's tried this before, telling the country to move on. Didn't work before. In fact, you might argue that it seemed to backfire. Has the environment, though, changed that it might work now? People's exhaustion, but also at a time when there are so many new revelations involving high-profile men and other documents that are still being called for, particularly by the women who are involved in this, the women who are the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that Trump has tried to get this to go away, including, months earlier telling his base, it's time to move on. We're done talking about this. And this is one of the issues that will not go away, in part because it is so tied up with some of the narratives and conspiracy theories that Trump himself has helped push. So to be clear, it is not a conspiracy theory at all about what Epstein did and what happened to these young women. That is a fact. But Trump's base in particular has been conditioned in many ways by the president himself to believe that there is sort of a dark cabal of Washington elites who behave with impunity. And this fits right into that. And as Trump knows better than anyone, this news cycle, even though it doesn't directly involve him, we're seeing new men who behaved in gross and crude ways. You know, as Peter said, not always illegal, but certainly something that you would not want public. And so that just generates more and more interest. So the president can say he wants it to go away, but it's pretty clear that that is not happening.
And Lisa, I want to remind people what the president is up against. This is what Epstein survivor Lisa Phillips told me just on Monday.
Todd Blanchard's most recent statement said any investigation into Trump or other men regarding the Epstein files is over. I would like to note how many times this has already been said by Pam Bondi. My response to his comment is like the age-old phrase, this isn't over until we say it's over, meaning the 1,200 survivors fight for our right to see all the files.
She says all the files. So in spite of what the DOJ says, in spite of what the president says, they say there is still so much out there that has not been released. What do we know about what's still out there?
Well, I think, Chris, as the days go on, many of the documents that people were most interested in seeing turn out to be within the files. So, for example, Congressman Massey and Khanna had talked about the fact that they wanted to see the draft prosecution memo and draft indictment that was prepared by Florida prosecutors. We have found those documents within these files. Some of the things, though, that we're not seeing, and survivors have called this to my attention, they say that they are troubled by the lack of documents pertaining to Ghislaine Maxwell, who herself has been convicted for her role in Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking scheme. And they say that they would have expected to see many more emails, many more videos, many more photographs of Ghislaine Maxwell herself. And they're troubled that their own information has been splashed across the public domain, has been eagerly reported on by newspapers both within and outside this country. And yet there are not a lot of revelations yet about Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, that may be because there are 3 million pages and it's difficult to boil the ocean in a weekend and a couple of days. But if it continues to be the case that there isn't that sort of investigative work done about Ghislaine Maxwell evident in the files, I think that's a reasonable question for survivors to ask. And of course, the other question that people like Lisa Phillips are asking is, why didn't I get access to the stuff pertaining to me first before you gave it to everyone? And is this all that's out there that you have about me? I'd like to know how you considered my testimony or the witness interview that I gave you. I'd like to know what investigative work you did about me. We can see, for example, in some of the files that they were looking at some of the survivors' MySpace pages and the earlier Florida investigation to assess their credibility. It would be nice for the survivors to have the peace of knowing what did the Department of Justice and FBI know about them and consider relevant before they gave it to the American people.
So, Ashley, I want to play a little more of what we heard from the president when CNN's Caitlin Collins pressed him on his response to survivors.
What would you say to people who feel like they haven't gotten justice, Mr. President?
Something that people care about. Yeah, what did you say? Go ahead.
What would you say to the survivors who feel like they haven't gotten justice?
You are the worst reporter. No wonder CNN has no ratings because of people like you. You know, she's a young woman. I don't think I've ever seen you smile. I've known you for 10 years. I don't think I've ever seen a smile.
Well, I'm asking you about survivors of Jeffrey Epstein,
You know why
Mr.
you're not
President?
smiling? Because you know you're not telling the truth. And you're a very dishonest organization, and they should be ashamed of you.
These are survivors of a sexual abuser.
Not answering the question, once again, no empathy. What do you take from his insistence on always deflecting away from talking about or to or anything that's relevant regarding Epstein's survivors?
I mean, first of all, again, empathy has never been this president's strong suit, but this is one of the reasons why this issue is such a problem for him. You know, nothing has come out that he has done illegal that we're aware of. But this is an issue where people desperately want to see someone express some empathy and understanding for these young women, and that is not what the president is capable of doing. And as for his, how upset he gets every time this comes up, even what we do know, what's public, pictures of Trump and Epstein when they were younger, partying comments Trump has made about Epstein liking younger women. So showing that Trump knew he liked younger women, although, again, we don't know that he was talking about underage. But none of this is a good look for anyone involved, certainly not a sitting president who has, dozens of prior accusations and allegations of sexual misconduct and behavior against him.
Peter, I was thinking as we were putting this together about your book on the first Trump presidency, The Divider, and the moral choices that faced the people around him, how many of them stood up to him. When you look at these two cases we're talking about today, and maybe even when you look beyond that, let's say to the immigration crackdown, has the power to hold the line, or at least maybe accountability to some extent, shifted, this time to the public, to the real people directly feeling the real impact?
Well, you're right to say that he's surrounded these days by a different crop of advisors than he was in his first term. In his first term, he had never been in public office before. He didn't really know how things worked. He brought in a number of people, conventional Republicans, military officers, people who had, dedication to institutions, and then at various points along the way tried to restrain him, advise him against doing things they thought were, impractical, unwise, maybe illegal. This time around, he's surrounded by people who know exactly who he is and have decided they're perfectly comfortable with that, and in fact, maybe cheer it on, agree with his ideology or his politics, his policies. They're not troubled, obviously, by his past, the allegations of his relationships with women and what he's done with women, because obviously they've known about all of those things when they took these jobs, and they're not in there to, stand in his way. They're there to facilitate him as they see it. So it's a very different term in that sense. He's surrounded by people who are enablers and facilitators, people who agree with him and aren't troubled by the things that troubled people in his first term. And so you're right. If there's accountability, it's not through his staff. It does seem to be through Congress, where there was a bipartisan majority in both houses to release these files.